Okay, so it's 2 o'clock exactly, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming to our presentation. We really appreciate it. Um, sorry. 1 second, just trying to get this out. Okay, so yes, so thank you all for coming to our webinar presentation entitled Expanding ID Access for LGBTQ Youth Experiencing Homelessness. This webinar is brought to you in collaboration from NASTAD as well as the Center for American Progress. So for some brief introductions, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Marcel Bird. I work here at NASTAD. We're the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, and I am the Racial and Gender Justice Fellow here, and I'm joined by Shabab. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Shabab. I'm a research assistant with the LGBT Progress team at the Center for American Progress. If you're not familiar with the work we do, we're a national nonpartisan think tank. We do policy research on a number of different areas. And my focus is on LGBT policy, specifically LGBTQ youth policy.
Wonderful, thank you. And so just so everyone knows, if anyone has any issues with with hearing us or anything like that, feel free to send us a quick chat message and we'll work to our best ability to address that. Also, these slides will be available after the presentation. So yeah, so just to jump into this with a brief overview. So basically the way this is going to work is that we're going to start out by just talking about IDs in general and, sort of like the services and programs that having an ID allows us to access and sort of the ease that an ID can bring into our lives. From there, we'll transition into talking about LGBTQ homelessness, incarceration, and poverty, and then we'll move over and talk a bit more about sort of the more ID-specific part of the presentation, and we'll be starting with talking about a key piece of legislation known as the Real ID Act of 2005. From there, we'll start talking about sort of the challenges that youth experiencing homelessness in particular experience when it comes to accessing ID, as well as the challenges that LGBTQ youth in particular experience. After that, we'll sort of take a more optimistic turn and talk a bit more about sort of examples of ways to expand ID access, and then what we all can do as health department staff, community-based organization staff, activists, etc. And then we'll sort of close off with talking about some current challenges, followed by Q&A. So to start out, significance of IDs. So having a government-issued photo identification is required for a number of services. And so as you can see, as illustrated here, an ID is required for things like opening up a bank account, in a lot of cases picking up prescriptions, applying for a job, travel, whether that be by interstate or through air, and in some states even voting. And this list is not exhaustive at all. There are a lot of other services that are restricted if you do not have an ID. Some other things that come to mind are things such as accessing certain public and private buildings, such as courthouses and public libraries. You often need an ID. And interestingly enough, even accessing services that would be particularly helpful for people experiencing homelessness, such as obtaining housing, or even applying for public benefits such as SNAP or Medicaid. Oftentimes you do need an ID. Applying for school and work programs is often required as well. So it's one of those things where if you do have an ID, you often don't necessarily notice the amount of things that you need it for, but if you lack an ID, it's very much apparent that you need it for a number of very vital services, especially if you're coming at this from a place of experiencing homelessness. So Shabab, would you mind talking a bit about sort of the ease an ID can bring?
Certainly. I think a lot of the things Marcel outlines are exactly why you would want an ID, right? In order to fill out prescriptions or travel or hold a steady job. Those are all different ways in which you can deal with the problem of homelessness. So some of the services that can come that are publicly provided, whether that's getting access to food stamps or even going to a employment program, you might need an ID in order to get into those. So having an ID can really help you with that. This young leader that we're working with, Sade Hamilton, said, "Without an ID, you're nobody, you don't exist." And I thought that was a really interesting quote because it sort of talks about how the ID itself is at its core, it's an identity document, right? It gives that sense of recognition and of being recognized by your government. So aside from all of the public benefits that you can get from it, at its core, it's a piece of, it's a document that validates who you are. And for all of those reasons, I think an ID can really ease the challenge of experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, definitely. And it's certainly, an ID isn't necessarily like an upstream, necessarily I guess public health solution that will prevent things like, homelessness and poverty, for example. But as this illustration proves, it's sort of like a low hanging fruit solution, something simple that we can use to sort of tangibly increase equity and reduce homelessness, poverty, and recidivism. So moving on to talking about LGBTQ, homelessness, incarceration, and poverty. So to start out, we're talking about LGBTQ youth homelessness in particular. This is a percentage that a lot of us are unfortunately very familiar with. So 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. And so oftentimes when we think of homelessness, we sort of the go-to place are, places such as shelters. We think of these as sort of the go-to spot for anyone who's experiencing homelessness. But interestingly enough, shelters are renowned, notorious for being particularly hostile environments for LGBTQ youth. We'll get to talking about this a little bit later, but with an ID application, oftentimes you need, with an ID, oftentimes you'll need a proof of residency. And so while some states allow for shelter to qualify, again, keeping in mind that shelters can be hostile environments is very much crucial. So going on, it's interesting because homelessness is very much tied into incarceration, which we'll very much get into in a moment. But in a lot of ways, even activities that are associated with homelessness are criminalized. So things such as sitting down, panhandling, lying down, things like that. And while we're talking about foster care isn't necessarily linked to homelessness in particular, it's interesting to talk about just sort of state care. And many youth who are in foster care lack identification. And while there is legislation that is making it so that states are required to provide identity documents to people as they are exiting foster care at the age of 18, that doesn't take into account youth who might be leaving those systems at an earlier time. So moving on and talking about LGBTQ youth incarceration. So according to the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, 16% of transgender individuals have been in prison or jail at some point. And then on top of that, as many as 13 to 15% of youth in juvenile detention identify as LGBTQ. And so this is interesting because as we're thinking about ID access and sort of the systems that interact with it, we definitely need to sort of draw these lines between, for example, youth and incarceration. So as we look at, for example, the high rates of youth that identify as LGBTQ, as well as the criminalization of activities associated with homelessness, such as sitting down, panhandling, et cetera, as well as the sort of the economies and the other activities that people in this age group will often have to go into, such as sex work, that leads to these high rates of incarceration. It's certainly not a coincidence that there's a high rate of homelessness and concurrently a high rate of incarceration among LGBTQ youth. Bringing it back to an ID piece, many youth and adults who exit correctional facilities don't have a state ID upon exit, and that can be for a number of reasons. It can be because of, for example, it can be because, for example, it can happen as a result of because these people may not have a state ID to begin with, or because oftentimes while people are experiencing incarceration, their ID documents are lost. So there might be misplaced by law enforcement or something like that. And interestingly enough, a lot of law enforcement officers will use a lack of ID as a means to incarcerate youth. So it's oftentimes used as a means to profile. So lastly, talking about LGBTQ poverty. So these stats don't in particular encompass youth in general, but it's more so just talking about just sort of like adults and the general context for LGBTQ people. I think it's important to note just because as we look at people, for example, exiting homelessness and accessing sort of like general society, it's important to kind of keep in mind the context that these people will often be entering into. So according to the National Survey of Family Growth, 24% of queer women live in poverty, with Black lesbians experiencing the highest rates of poverty among same-gender couples. And so sort of like shifting it from a queer lens to like a more transgender lens, transgender people are 4 times more likely to live at a household income of $10,000 or less, twice as likely to be unemployed. Transgender people of color experience unemployment at 4 times the national average. And lastly, according to the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, 90% of transgender people surveyed reported experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. So again, linking, for example, linking poverty to incarceration to homelessness, et cetera, we need to acknowledge that yes, there are a lot of things that happen that inform these percentages. You know what I mean? There's a lot of sort of like on-the-job discrimination that people might face. And things like that, but also, you know, looking at things that happen before people even get into, for example, a job interview, talking about, for example, the fact that there's such a high percentage of people in the LGBTQ community experiencing homelessness, which in turn leads to incarceration. The fact that oftentimes, you know, when people are applying for a job, you need to talk about your criminal history, which can be prohibitive in a lot of ways, and sort of like lead to these outcomes, and sort of like the economies that people are forced to enter because of just general societal discrimination. It's important to have this all in context. So now we're going to shift and talk a bit about sort of the more pieces of the presentation. So Shabab, would you mind taking over?
Certainly. Thanks, Marcel. So the Real ID Act was something that was passed in 2005, which some of you may be familiar with. If you've traveled anywhere on a plane recently, you might see that there's signs talking about how state IDs from certain states are no longer accepted by the TSA for getting on a plane because they might not be compliant with the federal Real ID Act. What that does is, this was something developed post 9/11 to make sure that everyone's identity could be documented with a more rigorous set of standards. So that was sort of the impetus behind putting that law into place. And as you can see, it requires documents proving your identity, your date of birth, whether or not you're in the US legally, and a whole host of other things. And it has some very strict requirements on what documents you can or cannot use. Now, as you can imagine, for a young person who's experiencing homelessness, they might not have a copy of their birth certificate with them. They might have a social security card that's in a previous home where they were living, where if they don't have a good relationship with their family, they might not be able to go back and ask for a copy of their social security card when they're not on speaking terms to begin with. Or even if they are in a really good relationship with their family, they might not, their family members themselves might be incarcerated or experiencing homelessness. So for all sorts of reasons, the burden of proof that was established by the Real ID Act creates a lot of very burdensome requirements for youth experiencing homelessness. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is when you look at that list, whether it's the birth certificate, the passport, and then you get the very circular logic, right? Of in order to get an ID, you have to have an ID to begin with, and that's a whole other set of things. But a lot of these documents also cost money to get. We'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation, but it's just something to bear in mind that this federal piece of legislation really upped the ante in terms of the burden of proof that was required for in order to get a state-issued ID card. Can we move on to the next slide?
Yes, sorry. Having some technical difficulties. Oops, sorry. OMG. Sorry, y'all, this is my first webinar. Having some technical difficulties. I will move this along. Okay. Sorry. Yes, that
There
was
we
it.
go. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, continue.
So as I said, there's a number of challenges that come up with youth experiencing homelessness, one of them being parental consent. So the idea behind this is if you're an unaccompanied minor, if you're under the age of 18 and you're trying to apply for an ID, your state law might require you to get permission from a parent or guardian. And that might not be possible for all sorts of reasons. You know, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of LGBTQ youth in particular, but all sorts of youth might not have good relationships with their families of origin. And even when they do, if their families of origin are also in unstable conditions where they're not in, they might be in a shelter themselves, or they might have a parent who's incarcerated. So getting that parental consent can be a little tricky. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is it can be very expensive. While the fees do vary state by state, the getting $10 can be a very big difference for someone who's in a very unstable housing situation. And oftentimes, you know, it's not just a matter of having being able to set aside that money to begin with, but a lot of providers that we speak with talk about how it's hard to convince the youth that they're working with that it is worth the 10, 15, 20, sometimes upwards of $50 that they need to set aside to get an ID when they're disillusioned with a lot of the systems that have posed so many challenges for them. So even that small amount of money can make a very big difference. We are seeing some states that are taking steps towards creating exceptions. So either getting fee waivers or having reduced fees, but those also come with a few requirements, such as getting a letter from the youth homeless shelter you're at saying, you know, certifying that yes, this person is indeed experiencing homelessness, so they should be able to get a reduced cost ID. So there are a few additional steps you have to take even when those solutions are built in. Other things include age restrictions. So in some states, if you're below a certain age, you just can't get access to an ID at all. This can be anywhere from 12 to 16, depending on which state you're looking at. And in other places, the age restriction can be waived, but once again, only if your parent is applying with you or your parent is there in person at the DMV or RMV or the relevant state office. So that creates a whole other set of barriers for youth experiencing homelessness. The proof of residency is something that can affect both people who are, both youth that are undocumented, but also youth that do have documented status. So if you're a youth that's undocumented, you just don't have the option to prove lawful status in the country. But even for those who can, having those documents can be a challenge because once again, it's very unlikely that they have a copy of their birth certificate in their backpack when they've been kicked out onto the streets by their family. But in terms of actual, the other aspect of residency, right? It's not just in terms of lawful residency, but also a literal residence. So if you go to the DMV, you apply for your ID card, and they say, "Great, fine, we'll send it to you." They're going to ship it to your address, but that requires that you have an address to begin with. You know, once again, you can create workarounds where you can have it mailed to a shelter and pick it up from there, or to some other sort of service agency. But that's one other barrier you have to work with, where you have to prove that you have an address. And we'll talk a little bit about some solutions for that later on. And of course, with all of these documents, if they're stolen or lost, or you never got around to obtaining them in the first place, that creates another set of barriers. And then, of course, for LGBTQ youth in particular, you can move on to the next one, Marcel.
Mm-hmm.
For transgender youth, there's the problem of having an ID that accurately reflects their chosen name and their chosen gender. Gender markers are required by the Federal Real ID Act. It doesn't specify what they must say, but it specifies that they must have them. So if you can imagine, if you're a young transgender person who's presenting outwardly in one way, but the gender listed on their ID is something different, it can create all sorts of problems when you're trying to access emergency housing, when you're being stopped by law enforcement. So having that discrepancy can be a real big problem. But the process towards changing that gender marker is quite burdensome. As it says on the slide, at least 15 states require proof of reassignment surgery, which, as you can imagine, is very expensive and something that not a lot of youth are wanting to do at that stage in their lives. So it creates this burden. And the other thing, of course, is not a lot of youth are able to legally do that while they're still minors. So essentially saying that it's impossible for transgender youth to get a gender marker that accurately reflects their gender. Other requirements can be getting a court order or an amended birth certificate, once again, just piling onto that list of very expensive documents that they need to have. And if you'll move on to the next one, Marcel. And of course, the other part is having their name changed. Once again, a similar list of requirements in terms of having court orders or proof of surgery and proof of, even if it's not necessarily a proof of reassignment surgery, it can sometimes be proof of medical treatment, which once again, is preventative and requires a source of income that may not be available to some of these youth. What else? Oh, and of course, the actual process of can just be, in terms of getting the form and all that. The process can vary a lot state to state. In some states, it's very straightforward. In others, it requires that aforementioned list of proof and permissions and signatures and all of
that. Wonderful. So now we're going to sort of move in a slightly more positive direction. So we talked about the rates of homelessness, incarceration, and poverty. We talked about challenges among youth, especially LGBTQ youth in particular. So now we're going to talk about some ways to expand ID access and what different places have done. So to start, we're going to talk about municipal ID programs. So municipal IDs are really, really awesome. And they're a more recent development. They've been kind of emerging more so in the past 10 years or so. And so basically, these are forms of ID that exist within cities. And the interesting thing is that they can act independently of state and federal requirements. But the great thing is that within those cities, they're very much valid forms of identification. But because of the fact that they are not state and federally regulated, there's a lot more room with how the IDs are put together. And the policies that inform those IDs can be a lot more inclusive. So, for example, when it comes to municipal ID programs, you often will see places like, Phoenix, New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, places like that have these programs. And in particular, New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, and New Haven, these types of IDs are especially accessible for undocumented individuals, which is great. And then on top of that, these IDs are allowed to be kind of much more up to date in terms of their gender marker policies. New York City, for example, has 3 gender categories. And so it's male, female, and not designated. I want to say the third option is. So again, much more range with how people can identify. And what's awesome as well is that when it comes to even proving residency or identity, there's much more wiggle room with what kind of documents are accepted. So things such as a letter from a city agency, from a nonprofit, a clinic, etc., can serve as a proof of residency, which in a lot of cases isn't really the case. And what's awesome too is that since these are valid forms of ID, these allow for easier interactions with authorities. It's easier to access financial and city services. Easier to clarify medical and emergency information, and also just going back to the law enforcement piece, since not having ID is often used as a way to profile, having this is a good way to combat that, and so you don't fall victim to facing additional punishment because you do not possess an ID. And lastly, these IDs are just very, very creative. Oftentimes they sort of double as prepaid debit cards, and give access to public transportation, libraries, and even discounts to to businesses and city-owned attractions. So very much an all-in-one sort of multi-purpose card that a lot of places have been doing as of late, and it's been really, really awesome. And a particular shout out to New York. So the New York Coalition for Homeless Youth over the past about 15 years or so has been doing some really, really awesome advocacy work. They've been working a lot with basically building relationships with the DMV staff in order to make the process for applying for an ID for people experiencing homelessness, especially youth, a lot simpler. So they've been able to create a form known as a statement of identity, which basically is like an alternative form that folks can use if they lack identity documents, which is great. And then Florida in particular got really creative, and they actually made sort of like a mobile ID clinic. So essentially it's a bus, literally a bus that drives around, and people who are experiencing homelessness can get on this bus. They're professionals who know how the process works, and then they're able to work with them in order to access an ID, which is great because, I mean, keeping in mind, for example, if you're experiencing homelessness, oftentimes, I mean, you lack like internet access, transportation, telecommunications, things like that. So having something come to you reduces that barrier of transportation, and it just makes the whole process a lot simpler. And so moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can all do as health department staff, as community-based organization staff, and as activists. So Shabab, do you want to get us started?
Sure. So first of all, the wonderful municipal ID programs that Marcel described are are something that you can really do at the local level. We're seeing a lot of interest from a lot of more progressive communities, regardless of whether it's regardless of the politics of the state, who are really interested in supporting their undocumented communities with a lot of the sanctuary city movement. And we really want to highlight that there's possibility while creating that municipal ID program to ensure that it also works for LGBTQ youth. Whether that's ensuring that it's possible to make a gender marker that can list male or female or undesignated, so that youth that don't identify within the gender binary can have that option listed. Or even adults can have that option when they're selecting a municipal ID. And the other thing to keep in mind is something that a lot of these cities and communities have done is when you add on these, whether it's a banking feature or allow these municipal IDs to give you discounts at museums and restaurants and whatnot, it makes these municipal IDs a very attractive option, so that it's not only folks who are undocumented or experiencing homelessness or transgender youth who are the ones applying for these IDs, but everyone in the community is wanting to get these IDs. So making sure that it's attractive for the entire community is a very effective way to make sure everyone signs on. And of course, as you're doing this, tapping into nonprofit networks that might have a lot of the connections that help make that possible is one really effective way. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, bringing the IDs to the youth. Now, whether that means creating a literal ID mobile van where, as we saw in the Florida case, this bus travels from place to place, making it more accessible, or even other models where if you have a fair with homeless services, right? Oftentimes people will have fairs where different shelters come through. People will offer haircutting services, employment services, food stamps, even just hot meals provided the day off. That can also be a very good time to bring in representatives from the DMV or other ID agencies to help folks get their birth certificates, their state-issued IDs, and other ID documents. And then, of course, recognizing that a lot of the youth experiencing homelessness are involved in multiple systems, whether that's, as Marcel mentioned before, foster care, juvenile justice, or even the adult criminal justice system for youth that are above the age of 18, what we sometimes call transition-aged youth. So they can be part of the adult criminal justice system as well. And those while they can be barriers, they can also be opportunities, right? Because we know that we have access to the youth while they're participants in those systems. There's legislation like the one mentioned here, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And it allows people who are above the age of majority to get IDs when aging out of foster care, because sometimes they can fall through the cracks just because of the way definitions work with regards to age. But in general, just whether it's through legislation or people who are working directly with the youth, whatever hat you might be wearing as you support the youth that you work with, making sure that they have identification before they age out of the system. One idea that we've seen work is having actual DMV staff stationed at jails or prisons. I know that this was something that the County of Los Angeles was looking into, where they were trying to partner with the state of California DMV and have actual staff from the DMV stationed at their correctional facilities. So that can really be one way to literally shorten the distance between youth and the IDs that they need.
Wonderful. So now we're going to talk a little bit about state policy recommendations, things that we can do on a state level to make this all a little bit simpler. So to start out, so the good news with the Real ID Act is that it does allow for states to create exceptions for individuals who are unable to meet certain documentation requirements. So for example, in Utah, for their proof of residency, they have a provision that basically says that, quote, other documents are accessible to the division upon review. So again, it's a very small provision, but it's something that allows for flexibility. A lot of states don't necessarily have a clear process for what that looks like for applying for an ID for people who are experiencing homelessness. So using the Real ID Act's capacity in order to bolster that is a very good move for sure. Next to that, working to reduce and eliminate fees for IDs is definitely a good start, but also we need to look at the necessary supporting documents, such as birth certificates. So for example, 22% of states, including DC, have some sort of infrastructure to reduce or eliminate fees for folks who are experiencing homelessness, people who have documented disabilities, and things like that. So really good models exist, for example, in Connecticut, in Illinois, Kentucky, DC, like I mentioned. But the thing is that even within these states, oftentimes in order to prove a state of homelessness, you have to, for example, show that you are participating, or basically to qualify, you would have to show that you are participating in some sort of public benefit program, such as SNAP, for example. And so things like that, that's tricky because even to access a public benefit program like that, you often have to have an ID to begin with. So in order to be like fully inclusive, it's best to sort of cater on the side to not necessarily requiring you to provide extensive documentation, nor mandating that they participate in any public benefit program in order to have access to a free or reduced cost ID. Next to that, just lowering or eliminating parental consent requirements is very good, very much since, a lot of these youth are in situations because they have sort of like more tense, abusive, strained relationships with their family. So acknowledging that, making that a requirement to access an ID is just really challenging and tricky for no particular reason. And then moving on, just providing alternative verification processes for proof of identity and residence. And accepting more documents is always a great place to start. So for example, in a bunch of places, things such as school transcripts or correctional facility records, employment ID cards, school ID cards, things like that can kind of double as a proof of identity, which is great. But also at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of youth experiencing homelessness may not even have access to those types of documents. So sort of erring on the side of allowing more documents, but even, for example, in the event that someone is unable to provide any sort of official documentation, even something as simple as maybe like a letter from a service provider or an affidavit of residency or identity or something like that should certainly be able to suffice. So just making sure that like in the design of provisions to increase access, keeping in mind that there are always going to be groups of people who don't have honestly any sort of identity documents, and how we can best cater to that population as well. So moving on, we definitely need to work to update policies on gender markers. Altogether, we definitely need to eliminate the requirements of surgery or specified treatment for gender marker changes. In a lot of ways, this kind of represents state violence, just in that, you know, gender is something that very much is up to the individual. It's how someone identifies on the individual level. So for the state to say that you need to have a certain surgical treatment for us to acknowledge your gender is violent. And so eliminating that requirement altogether would just be a better move. Also, given the fact that, like Shabbat mentioned, a lot of people cannot access these surgeries for financial reasons, especially if they're homeless. But then on top of that, there are plenty of people who are transgender that also just choose not to have any surgical procedures, and that's okay too. So just making sure that our policies reflect that is very much important. Also, on top of that, I mean, New York City, again, has three gender categories. So expanding things like that is more accepting of non-binary communities, so that's always a good move. And then next to that, just also making sure that ID agency staff are trained in cultural responsiveness and are better able to serve trans and gender non-conforming people. Just because there have been some instances in which people have been, for example, misgendered while trying to get identification. And so just making sure that ID agency staff are sort of sensitive to those particular needs is only going to lead to a better experience for everyone involved. And as we're working to sort of update the policies on gender markers and name changes and things like that, we also need to look at other forms of identification, such as, you know, social security number cards, passports, things like that, birth certificates, just to make sure that, like, as we're adjusting things for state IDs, we also are adjusting the requirements for other forms of identification, because those are going to certainly be important as well, and they all certainly play into one another. And lastly, just making sure that making any changes, requirements for obtaining ID readily available and easily understood. In a lot of places, it's kind of unclear. I know there are 12 states in particular that don't really have a particular protocol for people who are experiencing homelessness and applying for ID. So just making sure that, like, any changes are really accessible and understood just makes everything a lot easier for people who are applying for ID, but also people who are advocating on behalf of those who need IDs as well.
So one thing that I hear often from a lot of providers is that they don't have any LGBTQ constituents. And to that I say, how do you know that? It's very important to be collecting data on the people that you're serving to figure out whether or not you have LGBTQ constituents. So collecting SOGI data, or sexual orientation and gender identity data, can be very important as part of, you know, whether you do it through the intake forms that your organization has, whether it's a community-based organization or whether you're part of an agency, making sure that you're tracking that information can be very important. So that then when you go on and are trying to advocate for your LGBTQ constituents, you can back that up with the numbers proving that they're there. Of course, the thing to keep in mind is that folks might not choose to disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity if it's not safe for them to do so. So it's completely important to create that option for people to self-identify, you know, as part of whatever routine surveys or intake forms that you might have. But it's also important to create a safe environment so that they can go ahead and self-identify when the opportunity presents itself. And then, of course, if you are tracking, if you're working with youth, if you can start tracking how many of them have IDs to begin with, that can also be a good way to set up a baseline and figure out how far along you can get with the progress. And our organization has a number of resources available on how exactly to ask that question. And we can talk about that more during the Q&A. And then finally, we've talked a lot about all the different things that an ID allows you to do, but one way is to sort of flip that on its head and say, what if we no longer needed an ID to do those things, right? I know that here in DC, our LGBTQ center requires an ID just to get into the building. And what would it look like to no longer require that for people trying to access that space? So thinking not just about how do we expand ID access, but how do we reduce the many, many, many reasons why IDs are so important and necessary, so that people without them can have just as much access to the same things.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you, Shabab. And so lastly, I read a really, it was called Detransitioned by the State. And basically, there's an article in which a Wisconsin academic basically talks about his experience of being forced to detransition as a state employee by the state legislator. So he's an academic, and essentially he's being forced to provide more documentation, such as a declaration of his name/gender marker before transitioning, a proof of identity, as well as a quote proof of gender, in order to maintain his current legal gender. So as we look at ways to expand ID access and make this process much more inclusive, we also need to kind of keep in mind that since ID laws vary a lot from state by state, we need to stay vigilant and like kind of, you know, sort of make sure we have an eye out for any sort of like updated transphobic policies such as this, and make sure that we have the proper defense and resistance when things like that arise. So that's everything on our end. We have about feel free to type your questions into the chat function, or you can raise your hand and we can promote you to a speaker and you can sort of orally ask your question. We also have like a direct Q&A link, so people can just like ask questions there as well. So if there are any questions, let us know.
And while you take a moment to think about that, Marcel, if it's all right, I'll just speak for a little bit, which is just to say that there's such a range of things that you can do as staff at health departments, as people at community-based organizations. It can be everything from making sure that your organization is safe for LGBTQ youth, and particularly for those who are in vulnerable situations, like those who are experiencing housing instability, but also thinking about whether you're trying to advocate for policy change, whether that's at the city level, the local level, the state level. There's all sorts of things that you can do to make the situation better. And if you have ideas on specifics, we're happy to help you think through that.
Definitely. So I just got a question about if the presentation will be emailed. Yes, it will be emailed. And for also recording this webinar, so that will be available as well on the NASTAD website. Okay, so we have a raised hand. Okay, how do I, sorry, one moment. Okay. Okay. So, Jerry, feel free to ask your question. You're unmuted.
Hi. I was going to ask about the importance of having staff to have ID. We were doing outreach in Penn Station in Newark, and one of my trans staff persons was threatened with being arrested because we were handing out condoms, even though she had her, agency ID with her. We had to get out of Penn Station because of that.
Interesting. What's the aftermath been like from that situation?
Well, what we've had to do is we have to get a permit from the police department, the Newark Police Department, if we want to go out and do street outreach. They threatened my staff person with solicitation because she was handing out condoms, even though she had agency, information in condom kits, which have lubes and information in them as well. So just, it's just got to be important for everybody to like have your ID on you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks
Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for raising that point, Gary, because I think one of what you're really bringing up is the fact that even when people are protected by the law and they're not doing anything illegal, that is not enough, that we know that this is a community that experiences discrimination. Whether that's literally because they're trying to do outreach and help vulnerable members of the community and they're being falsely targeted, or even because sort of going back to some of the things we were saying earlier at the policy level, we might know that it's illegal in certain jurisdictions to arrest someone for having condoms with them.
Right.
It might be against the law to, it might not be required by the law to have parental consent for an ID. It might be, so I know that in California, for example, it's required for a driver's license, but not for an ID. But the DMV uses the same form for both. So it's just one of those things where in the implementation, which is so far from when the law was created, it comes back and this is, I think it's important to sort of bear in mind that even when you know that you're in the right and you've got documentation proving that you're doing the right thing, and even when the police aren't supposed to use condoms to to criminalize you,
right,
they might sometimes just go ahead and do that.
Right.
So,
law enforcement is not always on the same page as we are.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Are there any additional questions? Okay, I'll give it a little bit longer in case people are still coming up with questions. Okay, see there's something in the, so we have a question that says, have agencies developed education for law enforcement?
The short answer is yes. As to how effective they've been, I'm not entirely sure. We have seen some promising examples of police departments working with communities. I know that a lot of police departments will have LGBT liaisons so that they can work directly with communities. I know here in DC we have a police officer who herself is transgender. And so when there are calls coming from the community of being harassed, she has offered herself as a resource to be that first point of contact. But once again, that's we know that it's going to be very hard to reach every single officer in every single police department, right? In terms of actually developing trainings, I don't know if there's been any that have happened, or educational programs. I don't know. I can't think of any off the top of my head. What I do know is, I want to say this was in Los Angeles, where the police chief just came up with a protocol for how to interact with transgender people if you're an officer. So rules in terms of what pronouns to use, how to address certain people, giving people who are being arrested the option of being able to choose the gender of the officer that conducts the pat down. So they've developed a few guidelines along those lines, working with the local transgender community. So I know that there are different sort of police agencies that have done that to varying extents. There's lots of sheriff's offices or other police departments all over the country that have adopted non-discrimination in their codes of conduct. But once again, it's as Gary points out, it's that gap between knowing that non-discrimination is in place and the implementation. Which isn't to say that that's of no use, right? Because if you um, if you can point to an instance of discrimination when that rule is already on the books, it um, you can, there's something to point at and sort of say, here's a guideline that you adopted yourself, and your officers are failing to comply with that. That's a much stronger situation than the alternative. So I would definitely think about, are there opportunities to work with your local law enforcement agencies, whether it's the county sheriff or the police department or what have you, to figure out ways um, to make sure that it's that all interactions are respectful. What else? Oh, and the other thing that I was thinking of is when Gary mentioned the thing about condoms, I think it was San Francisco where their district attorney refused to use condoms as evidence for prostitution charges. And once again, it might be a situation of some officers not following that rule, but when that public declaration was made that condoms will no longer be, just carrying condoms on its own with no other evidence will no longer be sufficient evidence to charge someone with prostitution. When people in the community know that, it puts them on a much better footing.
Definitely, definitely. And just to add on to that, Jabal definitely brings up many, many good points. And I would just also add that with outreach that goes towards law enforcement, there needs to be an equal effort to make sure that people, especially organizations that are serving youth, have campaigns that ensure that youth know their rights. So that, for example, if they do experience discrimination, they know what is within their rights of things to do. And I know that that's been much more mainstream as of late, but just emphasizing that on both ends is certainly important to highlight those efforts. And so we have another question, unless Shabab, you wanted to add anything else?
Nope.
Okay. We have a question that says, have any CBOs listening had success with having town halls on this matter that have included members of law enforcement? So if there's anyone on the call who works at a community-based organization that's had any success with having town halls on this issue, including members of law enforcement, feel free to raise your hand and we can totally give you all the floor to answer this question. Okay, we're just waiting a little bit. And just to repeat, for anyone that's working at a community-based organization, the question was, have any CBOs listening had success with having town halls on this matter that have included members of law enforcement? So if you have anything to contribute, feel free to raise your hand and we can turn over the speaking rights to you for a moment.
And while folks take a minute to think about that, there are a lot of police departments will have community outreach units that can be a good place to start. And whether it's inviting them to a town hall, whether it's having them host one, there's lots of different models you can take. But of course, as Marcel pointed out, you don't necessarily have to work directly with law enforcement in order to ensure that the communities you're working with know their rights, know what their legal options are. And oftentimes, while it can be great to include law enforcement so that they can sort of state their official stance on certain issues, having them at the table can sometimes put a limit on what gets discussed and what participants feel comfortable sharing. So whether it's having them there or not, there's lots of opportunities with community spaces.
Wonderful. Someone just contributed, a good way to establish communication with the city you work in is to check to see if there there is an existing community collaboration, a community collaborative in place. If so, you're in luck. This is a good way to get your information out. So thank you for that. So we have about 6 minutes left. Are there any remaining questions? Is there anyone who's able to answer the question about CBOs doing town halls? Any last pieces to add in?
And if not, Marcel, maybe we can end a little early and give folks some time in their day.
That's what I'm thinking. So yeah, so seeing none. Oh my God, why does this keep happening? I'm so sorry. Okay, so I want to make sure that everyone has their contact information if any questions arise or anyone has anything that they want to send our way. So briefly, these are the references that we use to create this presentation. So CAP, as well as the National Center for Transgender Equality, as well as the National Network for Youth, have amazing, amazing, amazing resources talking about ID access. So definitely get into those for sure. These are all the links we use, and on the bottom are more so toolkits. So definitely access those resources. A lot of really good information there. And again, these slides will be available as well as this webinar, and will be posted on the NASTAD website shortly. And so if you all ever feel the need to get in contact with us, again, my name is Marcel Bird. I work at NASTAD as the Racial and Gender Justice Fellow. My email is mbird@nastad.org.
And I'm Shabab. I just saw the message from Terrence. Apologies, I'm going to try and speak a little bit clearer into the microphone. I'm at smirza@americanprogress.org. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Marcel.
Yes, thank you all so much. And yeah, let us know if you have any questions. And that concludes our webinar. I'm sorry, just real quick. I'm not sure if this will be available in this meeting.